of the Disney tradition at that point. At the point that animation developed, what was important about it was the fact that people weren't quite sure what it was. Remember I showed you even the early Windsor Mckay, the Stuart Blackton, the enchanted drawing. You can see that they're not quite sure how to show it yet. There's the animator shows himself, or Windsor Mckay, there's that need to kind of explain it to an audience because people it was something they'd never seen before, so they almost felt that they had to sell it to the audience. And so it was a different sort of thing. They weren't quite sure who the audience was. It wasn't a child audience at that point. It was definitely an adult audience. If you think of the Emile Cole that we saw, you think of the Disney, you can see that the kind of humor in the Disney is a little bit too raunchy, a little bit too sort of surreal to be toward a child market. Also, if you look at the cartoons, the early Mickey Mouse, he's definitely not a cute little mouse yet. He's sort of more entrenched in the strange and the bizarre. And it's people like Emile Cole, the early Disney, and even Windsor Mckay, although Windsor Mckay with Gertie the dinosaur, for the first time you're seeing a cute character. The Disney animators really did look to Mckay for trying to create a realism. Okay. But interestingly, when animation first started out, with Emile Cole would have been one of the first, the phantasmagoria that we saw, would have been one of the first animations for people to see, be viewed with a wide public audience. And the kind of people who were drawn to these early animations it wasn't so much a mass public. The mass public were more drawn to animation when it became cute, when it became character-based, and something that kind of was more sort of for a mass audience, more geared towards entertainment. These early experiments in animation were often done by artists who were actually fine artists, so or who had come out of various artistic traditions. And the kind of people who were influenced or who admired these early works were other artists, other filmmakers who were at the same time producing what was known then as high cultural art making, like painters, people who were, and mostly the avant-garde artists. At the turn of the century, at the same time as early animation came out, the art movements, including film, the art movements or the art trend at that time, even in film, literature, art making, such as paintings, the sculpture, the traditional arts, and also in other forms of literature, was seen as the avant-garde. And the avant-garde, does anyone know what the word avant-garde means? I've actually forgotten. But I know what it means, but I've forgotten what it means.
At the forefront?
Yes, it means being at the forefront of revolution. The avant-garde were like during a war, I think they were the soldiers that went up in front. So anyone that was avant-garde at that time were people who were rebelling against tradition. They were looking for new ways of expressing themselves artistically. And if you think of the kind of art making that people were used to before the 20th century, it was mostly realism. It was art making before the developments of the camera, before the developments of the film camera. One of the main functions of art was to record reality, because there was no other way to record it with until, of course, the invention of the camera. So the function of art making before film, before the camera, was to show a realistic world, an illusion of a realistic world. And so art making was entrenched in this realist tradition. And artists, with the development especially of the camera, realized that, the camera can do that better, more faithfully. It's a much truer reflection. And so they felt the need, painters felt that painting was tired. They felt that there was nowhere to go, so what, they're sort of recording reality and that sort of thing. So, and art makers were quite disillusioned. So something like film and animation, and the kind of things that the way in which these artists, especially early animation, were not looking at reality. Like someone like Emile Cole. Remember the little figure, that little animation is not rooted in reality, is it? It's very surreal. The little clown's head gets chopped off. There are all sorts of strange distortions. And then you also see it's not really about a story or about reality. It's actually presenting the medium of animation. Emile Cole in that little animation was saying, here, look, this is a new medium. He wasn't It wasn't so much, the importance wasn't so much here, look at this very real story I'm showing, was it? It's more about, here, look at this new medium. Look what it can do. It can distort. It can create. The artist, here is my hand. The artist, through using this medium, can do this sort of thing. So what avant-garde artists, I will give you definitions of what avant-garde is. Avant-garde is very much, if you're doing art history, it's linked with modernism and art, early modernism. Okay, the same if you're doing English, if you're doing media, film studies, there was early film, early experimental film was very much linked up. So we're talking about 110 years ago, 100 years ago or so. So what intellectuals and artists saw in something like Emile Cole was something else, something that wasn't real, something that the artist could do that the camera couldn't do, something that the artist could do that a film camera couldn't do. So suddenly they saw in early animation things that they were interested in, because these artists, because they were against tradition, against representing a real world, they tried to find other things to do. And what was the inevitable outcome of artists reacting against realism? What emerged in art making in all forms for the first time? In art. What sort of forms? People stopped painting realistic things. So what is the opposite?
Fantasy.
Close. Yes, surrealism. That was linked. They were avant-garde. But if you take a real picture and say what they started doing, and I'll try to give you another clue, is they started moving away from the subject matter of reality, and they started looking at the medium as a subject matter. So in other words, if you were a painter, instead of trying to hide your paint and try and show an illusion of the real world, so when someone looks at that picture, they think it looks like the real thing, I could almost touch it. They decided to highlight the characteristics of the medium, of paint, for example. So the subject matter would be about brush mark. It would be about things that make up form, line, shape, space. So the subject matter was no longer about trying to reflect a real world. It was reflecting the reality of what they put on that canvas. Are you with me? And if you simplify something down and simplify something down and simplify something down, what do you get? Do you get a real looking thing? I'm trying to get you to say one word. Starts with A, yes. Abstraction. So these artists anyway were they were trying to find other ways of painting and making things, in sculpture too, even in early film they were experimenting with that, but then it was a new thing. But what they saw in these early animations, even in the early Mickey Mouse, was were people who were actually exploring things that spoke to them, that they were interested in too. So if you look at Emile Cole, he breaks up line and form into simplified shapes. He sort of destroys, eliminates. He shows the medium. He's investigating space, this new space in which to create movement in. So what you got artists who then realized that they could do this too, and they saw these early animations as equivalent to high art. Whereas about 10 years later with the Disney industry, suddenly, today animation is not equated with high art, is it? It's more equated with cheap entertainment, that sort of thing. And there's still this argument that's going on. But interestingly, the roots of animation are embedded in high art. And so what you got avant-garde, mostly painters, who put down their brushes and started making moving, painterly compositions, because they realized what animation was offering them was not only the similar things that they were exploring, but what else was animation offering them, something that they couldn't express on a canvas. What's the obvious thing? What is the obvious difference? Sorry? Movement and time. Yes, exactly. Movement, rhythm, time. So they were experimenting. If you break down what makes up images, it can be rhythm. It can be. So they were trying to experiment with ideas of rhythm and movement, and like, for example, doing sequences of images. So while it does, the narrative does unfold in space, they were lacking that element of real movement and time. And so they started making compositions that actually spoke to avant-garde ideals, but with the added dimension of time. And this was really significant. Unfortunately, and there were some amazing avant-garde artists. Unfortunately, what happened is a lot of the innovators, it was a time when